Elena Morgan stood in the center of the living room, morning light filtering through the leaded glass windows in patterns her grandmother had enjoyed for over 40 years. At 36, Elena had never expected to own property in this market, let alone inherit the charming craftsman home that had been the backdrop to so many childhood memories. The lawyer's call 3 weeks ago had caught her completely off guard. "She left it all to you," Mr. Winters had explained, his voice gentle with the understanding that this inheritance came intertwined with grief. The house, the furnishings, even her garden tools. Margaret wanted you to have a foundation, something solid. Elena ran her fingers along the oak banister her grandfather had installed in 1978. The wood was smooth from decades of touch, her grandmother's small hands, her own childhood palms sliding down during visits, and now her adult grip as the home's new owner. The significance wasn't lost on her. After years of professional uncertainty building her graphic design business while living in a cramped downtown apartment with unreliable heat and neighbors whose lives spilled through paper-thin walls, she now had roots. The house needed work, updating certainly, but nothing structural. The inspector had confirmed the bones were good, exactly what you'd expect from a house built when craftsmanship mattered. Elena had already begun making plans, imagining her workspace in the sunroom overlooking the backyard gardens that her grandmother had tended so lovingly. She was measuring for curtains when she first noticed Richard Caldwell, watching from his side of the shared privet hedge. Their eyes met briefly before he nodded with a stiff politeness and continued walking his meticulously groomed golden retriever. There was something calculating in that gaze that left Elena feeling vaguely unsettled. "Don't mind Richard," Mrs. Abernathy from across the street had told her that afternoon, stopping by with a housewarming pie and neighborhood gossip. "He's particular about the block. Been here 15 years and thinks that makes him the unofficial mayor of Oakwood Lane." "He and Grandma got along okay?" Elena asked, cutting them each a slice of still-warm blueberry pie. Mrs. Abernathy's pause was slight but noticeable. "Margaret was kind to everyone, you know that. But between us, Richard made several offers on this house over the past few years. Something about wanting it for his son Brandon, who's apparently a real estate investor of some kind. Your grandmother wouldn't even entertain the idea. This house was always meant for you." The following days brought a flurry of activity as Elena began settling in. She donated some of her grandmother's clothes to the women's shelter downtown, but kept the hand-knit sweaters that still carried traces of her perfume. She reorganized the kitchen, registered her change of address, and scheduled a consultation with a contractor about updating the bathroom's aging plumbing. Throughout it all, she noticed Richard's presence like a shadow at the periphery. It seemed to materialize whenever delivery trucks arrived or when the contractor's van parked in front of the house. His observations weren't quite intrusive enough to confront him about, but they felt intentional. A message being communicated without words. It was Marianne from 2 doors down who finally filled in the missing pieces as they both worked in their front gardens one Saturday morning. "Brandon's been quite vocal about wanting this place," Marianne explained, deadheading her roses with practiced precision. "He and his wife have a baby on the way, and apparently your grandmother's house fits perfectly into their 10-year investment plan. Something about the lot size and the corner location." "Investment plan?" Elena repeated, pausing with her gardening trowel midair. "Oh yes. Brandon has this whole strategy mapped out for the neighborhood. He's already bought the Peters' old house on Elm and converted it to a duplex. Richard's been his biggest champion, of course. Father-son real estate dynasty and all that." Marianne gave Elena a knowing look. "Just between us, your grandmother told me last Christmas she was updating her will specifically to make sure you got the house. She knew exactly what would happen otherwise." That evening, as Elena sat on the porch swing that had been her thinking spot since childhood, she noticed Richard standing at his mailbox, watching her house with unconcealed interest. He raised his hand in a neighborly wave that didn't reach his eyes. Elena returned the gesture, understanding now that what she had inherited was more than just a house. It was a position in a neighborhood chess match she hadn't agreed to play. Elena had just finished hanging the last of her grandmother's quilts on the wall of her new home office when the doorbell rang. 3 weeks had passed since she'd moved in, a period of adjustment filled with small victories, figuring out which key opened the garden shed, learning the peculiar rhythm needed to close the back door properly, discovering her grandmother's handwritten recipes tucked into cookbooks. When she opened the front door, Richard Caldwell stood on her porch with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His polo shirt was crisp, tucked into pressed khakis, dressed for business, not a casual neighbor visit. "Elena," settling in nicely, I hope. He stepped forward slightly, a subtle move that nearly forced her to step back and invite him in. "Thought we might have a chat about the house." Something in his presumptuous tone put Elena on alert, but she gestured him into the living room, where afternoon sunlight illuminated dust motes dancing above her grandmother's antique coffee table. "Coffee," she offered, more out of ingrained politeness than genuine hospitality. "No need to trouble yourself. This won't take long. Richard settled into the armchair as if he'd sat there many times before. Perhaps he had as her grandmother's neighbor, though Elena couldn't imagine Margaret warming to his company. He unzipped his portfolio and withdrew several neatly paper-clipped documents. I'll get right to it. My son Brandon, you might have seen him around. Tall fellow, drives the silver Audi, has been looking to buy in this neighborhood for some time. Oliva nodded, recalling the man she'd glimpsed a few times, watching her house with the same proprietary interests as his father. Brandon and his wife Melissa are expecting their first child in October, Richard continued, his tone suggesting this fact should hold special significance for Alina. They've been renting over on Maple, but with the baby coming. He spread his hands in a what-can-you-do gesture. They need more space, good schools, you understand. Congratulations to them, Elena said, sensing where this was heading. Richard slid a document across the coffee table. Brandon's prepared to make a very fair offer on the house. Cash deal, no inspection contingencies, flexible closing date. He tapped a figure circled in bold at the bottom of the page. I know you probably weren't planning to sell so soon after Margaret's passing, but wouldn't it be nice to have that nest egg? You could get something more suitable for a single person. Elena glanced at the offer, 20% below what her real estate friend had estimated as fair market value, and felt a flash of indignation. The assumption that her grandmother's beloved home wasn't suitable for her stung almost as much as the lowball figure. This is very unexpected, she said carefully, sliding the paper back toward him. But I'm not interested in selling. I just moved in, and I'm planning to stay. Richard's expression shifted so quickly it was almost imperceptible, the mask of neighborly concern giving way to something harder before he reassembled his features. I understand this might seem sudden, he pressed, ignoring her refusal. But Brandon has always admired this property. He and her grandmother had several discussions about it before her health declined. Discussions? Elena asked, remembering what Mrs. Abernathy had told her about Richard making offers that her grandmother had refused. Oh yes, informal talks about him potentially buying the place when she was ready to downsize. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Margaret seemed quite open to the idea of keeping the house in the neighborhood, so to speak. The casual lie about her grandmother, who had explicitly updated her will to ensure Elena would inherit the house, ignited something protective in Elena's chest. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said, standing to signal the conversation was ending. My grandmother left this house to me because she wanted me to have it. I have no plans to sell, not now, not in the foreseeable future. Richard's smile tightened as he collected his papers. You might want to sleep on it. Housing market's volatile these days. Brandon's offer won't be on the table indefinitely. The friendly tone had an unmistakable edge now. And between us, this neighborhood works best when folks understand the community dynamics. He paused at the door, looking back at the entryway with its original woodwork and stained glass accents. This place needs a family, Alina. Your grandmother would have understood that. The change was subtle at first, a coolness in Richard's nod when Alina collected her mail, Margaret Caldwell's sudden absence after briefly chatting over the hedge. Alina might have dismissed it as neighborhood awkwardness following the rejected offer, if not for what happened the following Tuesday. She could schedule contractors to replace the aging water heater. Nothing fancy, just necessary maintenance. The truck had barely pulled into her driveway when Richard appeared on his front lawn, phone in hand. Starting major renovations already? He called it over, his tone conversational but caring enough to ensure the contractors heard. I hope you've checked with the Historic District Commission. This neighborhood has strict regulations about modifications to original structures. The Ploner glanced at Alina, hesitating. Is this place under historic preservation? That changes the permit requirements. It's just a water heater replacement, Alina explained, feeling a tension headache forming. And no, we're not in the historic district. That's 3 blocks over. Richard shrugged and walked away. Mission accomplished. He'd planted doubt, caused delay. It took 20 minutes of phone calls for Alina to reassure the contractor they could proceed. This incident marked the beginning of what Alina came to recognize as a campaign. When she had the old maple tree in the backyard professionally trimmed after an arborist identified diseased branches, Richard reported her to the city for working without a permit. The fact that no permit was required for routine tree maintenance didn't seem to matter. The inspector's visit consumed half her workday. The pressure expanded beyond Richard's direct actions. His wife, Margaret, who served as treasurer for the neighborhood association, began subtly reshaping Elena's reputation among neighbors she hadn't yet met. I heard she's planning to convert it to multifamily units, Elena overheard Margaret telling another woman at the local coffee shop, not realizing Elena was in line behind them. Property values will plummet if we start getting transient renters. Richard tried to explain this to her, but apparently she's not concerned about neighborhood stability. The whisper campaign gained traction. Elena noticed certain neighbors would barely acknowledge her at the grocery store or while walking her recently adopted rescue dog, Luna. Several times she found flyers for local real estate agents tucked into her mailbox or doorframe, all featuring Brandon Caldwell's smiling face and neighborhood specialist credentials. The tactics grew increasingly direct. Brandon's silver Audi would frequently park directly in front of her driveway, positioned in a way that wasn't technically illegal but made it difficult for her to exit. Each time, Elena would have to knock on the Caldwell's door to have the car moved. "So sorry about that," Brandon would say with practiced concern he's dangling from his fingers. "Just visiting my parents. Streets are so narrow around here. Really better suited for single-family homes rather than multi-unit conversions, don't you think?" The implication was always the same. Elena didn't belong, her presence was disruptive, and her refusal to sell was causing inconvenience to everyone. By the 2-month mark, the pressure was affecting her work. As a freelance graphic designer, Elena relied on focus and creativity, both increasingly difficult to maintain with the constant low-grade stress of neighborhood hostility. Clients had begun to notice delays in her typically punctual project delivery. On a Thursday afternoon, while Elena was on a video call with an important client, the power went out, but only in her house. Looking outside, she saw every other home on the block still had electricity. The outage forced her to reschedule the meeting, potentially jeopardizing the contract. When the utility company arrived, they discovered the main breaker had been tampered with, probably just neighborhood kids, the technicians suggested. Elena wasn't convinced, especially when Richard appeared in his yard, watching the repair work with unconcealed interest. That evening, after restoring her power and salvaging what she could of her workday, Elena sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, surrounded by neighborhood association bylaws, property boundary maps, and utility easement documents. She'd been playing defense for weeks, reacting to each new pressure tactic. As she reviewed the pattern of escalation, a realization crystallized. The Caldwells wouldn't stop until she either sold or broke. "Not happening," she whispered to the empty kitchen, her grandmother's determination flowing through her veins. It was time to shift strategies. Elena gripped her coffee mug tightly as she read the neighborhood association email for the 3rd time. Under new business for the upcoming meeting was item 4C, discussion of property modifications and neighborhood character, R. Caldwell. The timing was no coincidence. Just yesterday, she'd scheduled painters to refresh her home's exterior with a historically appropriate color scheme. Making it public now, she murmured to Luna, who watched with sympathetic brown eyes from her bed in the corner. This was Richard's next move, leveraging the community against her. Elena had avoided the monthly meetings until now, busy with settling in and work deadlines, but absence was no longer an option. The community center buzzed with conversation when Elena arrived Thursday evening. She recognized some faces from her grandmother's funeral, others from casual encounters at the local shops. Several neighbors smiled warmly, but others glanced away when she caught their eye. Margaret's whisper campaign had clearly been effective. Elena chose a seat near the back, notebook in hand. Richard, positioned near the front with Margaret and Brandon flanking him, didn't acknowledge her presence. The meeting proceeded through budget reports and committee updates until President Bill Harrington, a retired professor who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, reached item 4C. Next, we have a discussion about property modifications presented by Richard Caldwell, Bill announced. Richard stood, adjusting his glasses with practiced authority. "Thank you, Bill. As many of you know, our neighborhood has maintained its distinctive character through careful adherence to certain aesthetic standards, formal and informal." He gestured to a PowerPoint slide showing historical photos of the street. "What makes Oakwood special is continuity. When someone purchases a home here, they become stewards of neighborhood heritage." He clicked to the next slide, a photo of Elena's house, clearly taken without her knowledge, with red circles highlighting areas of peel and paint and the spot where she removed an overgrown, diseased shrub. "Recently, we've seen concerning modifications to the Morgan property at 243 Oakwood Lane. While technically, these may not violate any ordinances, they represent a troubling departure from neighborhood standards." Elena felt heat rising in her face as Richard continued, revealing detailed knowledge of her renovation plans, information he could only have obtained by going through her mail or eavesdropping on her contractor conversations. Furthermore, Richard continued, there are indications of potential rental unit conversion, which would fundamentally alter the single-family character of our community and impact property values for everyone. The room's attention turned to Elena as murmurs rippled through the gathering. Bill Harrington cleared his throat. "Perhaps Ms. Morgan would like to address these concerns since she's present tonight." Elena hadn't planned to speak, but found herself moving toward the front of the room. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice remained calm as years of client presentations steadied her. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Elena Morgan. Many of you knew my grandmother, Margaret." She paused, making eye contact with familiar faces. "She lived in that house for 42 years and left it to me because she wanted it to remain a loved family home." She opened her notebook, revealing her grandmother's original 1980 paint color samples. I'm not converting anything to rental units. I'm simply restoring what time has worn away. The colors I've chosen, she continued, displaying the historically accurate paint swatches, are actually the original palette my grandfather selected, which have faded over decades. Alina then shared her modest renovation plans, detailed drawings showing how she was preserving the home's character while updating essential systems. Several older residents nodded appreciatively as she explained her intention to restore the garden using cuttings from her grandmother's original plantings. "I'd like to invite all of you to an open house next Saturday afternoon," she concluded. "See the renovations for yourself, look at the historical photos I've found in my grandmother's albums, and enjoy some refreshments. My home is part of this neighborhood's story, and I want to honor that legacy, not erase it." Bill Harrington was the first to respond. "I remember when your grandparents painted that house back in '80. Harold was so particular about matching the trim to the original specifications." He turned to Richard. "Seems to me Elena is showing exactly the kind of stewardship you were advocating for, Richard." As Elena returned to her seat, several neighbors stopped her to express support or share memories of her grandmother. Richard sat rigid in his chair, Brandon whispering urgently in. Elena's open house had been more successful than she anticipated. Nearly 30 neighbors had stopped by, admiring her thoughtful renovation plans and paging through her grandmother's photo albums showing the neighborhood's evolution across 4 decades. Several elderly residents had shared stories about Margaret that Elena had never heard, small kindnesses her grandmother had extended throughout the community over the years. The Caldwells had been conspicuously absent. 2 days later, Elena was working at her drafting table when a sharp, insistent knock interrupted her concentration. Through the stained glass panels flanking her front door, she recognized Brandon's silhouette, with Richard standing behind him. She considered ignoring them, but decided confrontation was inevitable. "Good afternoon," she said, opening the door but not stepping aside to invite them in. Brandon, dressed in a crisp business suit despite the Saturday afternoon, flashed what she assumed was his real estate closing smile. "Elena, hope we're not interrupting anything important." Without waiting for a response, he continued, "Dad and I have been talking, and we realize our initial offer might have seemed a bit hasty." He glanced back at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. "So I've drawn up a revised proposal I think you'll find very fair." He extended a manila envelope. Elena reluctantly accepted it, opening it to find a new offer letter. The price increased by a mere 8% from the previous lowball figure, still well below market value. "That's nearly $15,000 more than our initial offer," Brandon said, as if he were being extraordinarily generous. "And we're willing to be flexible in the closing timeline, up to 60 days if you need time to find a new place." Elena looked from the letter to Brandon's expectant face, then to Richard's more calculating expression. "I appreciate you taking the time to come by, but as I've said before, I'm not interested in selling." Brandon's professional demeanor faltered. "Look, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. Cash offer, no contingencies, no inspection headaches. You won't find a better deal in this market." "It's not about the money," Elena replied. "This is my home now. I'm not selling, not to you, not to anyone." Richard stepped forward then, his hand on his son's shoulder. "Brandon, give us a minute." Brandon hesitated, then walked down to the sidewalk, his posture rigid with frustration. Richard's voice dropped, his neighborly facade evaporating entirely. "Elena, I tried to be patient. I tried to be reasonable. But this situation is becoming untenable." "What situation would that be?" Elena asked, matching his quiet tone. "Me living in the house my grandmother left me." "You're being deliberately obtuse," Richard said. "Brandon has his heart set on this property. It's the cornerstone of his investment strategy for the neighborhood. We had an understanding with Margaret before she became confused in her final months. The implication that her sharp-as-a-tack grandmother had been mentally compromised sent a surge of anger through Elena, but she kept her expression neutral. Richard continued, "We can make things very difficult for you here. This is a close-knit community that works best when everyone cooperates. Your little open house may have won over some of the more sentimental neighbors, but the association board still has considerable influence." He gestured toward a freshly painted porch railing. "Building codes, property line surveys, variance applications. There are countless ways for a homeowner to find themselves in violation of one regulation or another. Addressing those issues can become quite expensive." The threat hung in the air between them. Elena had expected escalation after the community meeting, but hadn't anticipated such naked intimidation. "Are you threatening me, Richard?" she asked, her voice level despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm explaining reality," he replied. "Brandon's offer expires Monday at noon. After that, we'll need to explore other options for resolving this situation." As Richard turned to leave, Elena called after him, "You should know I've been documenting everything. The false complaints, the interference with my contractors, the rumors. Everything." Richard paused but didn't turn around. "Documentation only matters if someone cares to review it. In my experience, most people prefer not to get involved in neighborhood disputes. After the Caldwells departed, Alina closed her door and leaned against it, trembling not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying anger. The thinly veiled threats had accomplished what months of passive harassment cooled it. They had crystallized her resolve into something unbreakable. Legally, this crosses several lines, Camilla Rivera said, reviewing the evidence Elena had meticulously compiled. The attorney's office was warm and inviting, at odds with the serious expression on her face as she examined photos, emails, and Elena's detailed journal of incidents. Interference with contractors, spreading false information affecting your professional reputation, tampering with utilities. These aren't just neighborly disagreements. This is harassment. Elena felt vindicated hearing a professional confirm what she suspected. What can I do? Several things, Camilla replied, organizing Elena's documents into neat categories. First, security cameras, visible ones. Document everything going forward with time-stamped video evidence. Second, we'll prepare a cease and desist letter detailing the harassment and potential legal consequences. Third, file a police report about the utility tampering. That's criminal mischief at minimum. By the following weekend, Elena had implemented the first part of her strategy. 4 discreet but noticeable security cameras now monitored her property's perimeter. The installation technician had barely driven away when Richard appeared at his mailbox, phone in hand, photographing the cameras. Elena waved directly at him, and his phone letting him know she noticed. Her attorney had advised clear documentation that the Caldwells were aware they were being recorded in public spaces. A cease and desist letter from Camilla's office arrived at the Caldwells' home via certified mail on Tuesday. Elena watched from her kitchen window as Richard signed for it, his expression darkening as he read the return address. That afternoon, the harassment tactics abruptly changed. The Caldwells switched from overt pressure to conspicuous avoidance. Richard would turn around mid-walk if he saw Elena in her yard. Margaret canceled her shift at the neighborhood garden committee where she learned Elena had volunteered. Brandon's Audi no longer appeared on her street. With breathing room finally established, Elena proceeded with the second part of her strategy, community connection. Rather than isolating herself, she began actively participating in neighborhood life, joining the local business association and volunteering for the community garden's spring planting. She invited her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, for weekly tea, learning more about the neighborhood's history and establishing herself as a caretaker of its stories. Your grandmother would be pleased, Mrs. Abernathy said during one of their visits. Margaret always said this neighborhood needed more young people with respect for its history. Elena's third strategic move focused on her home itself. With the Caldwells temporarily neutralized, she proceeded with her renovation plans, meticulously following every code and obtaining every permit. When her contractors replaced the aging porch steps, Richard did call the city inspector, who arrived promptly, reviewed Elena's comprehensive permits, and verified that everything was perfectly to code. Not the first call we've had about your property, the inspector confided, but certainly the first time I've seen such thorough preparation. Most homeowners aren't this diligent. Elena smiled. I believe in doing things right the first time. The community's perception continued shifting as Elena's renovations took shape. The house's refreshed exterior paint, matching her grandmother's original color scheme, earned compliments from passersby. Her careful restoration of the original stained glass windows attracted attention from a local historical preservation blog, which featured her project as an example of thoughtful modernization that respected architectural heritage. 6 months after the confrontation on her porch, Elena hosted the neighborhood's annual garden tour. Visitors admired how she'd integrated modern outdoor living spaces while preserving the established garden beds her grandmother had created. Several neighbors lingered afterward, sharing gardening tips and neighborhood news. From her kitchen window, Elena spotted Richard watching from his driveway, his expression unreadable. Brandon's absence was notable and explained the following week when Elena overheard at the local cafe that Brandon and his wife had purchased a Victorian Riverside, a neighborhood across town. Different investment strategy, someone explained. They're focusing on properties with vacation rental potential now. That evening, as Elena sat on her restored porch swing enjoying the spring twilight, she recognized what had changed. The house no longer felt like contested territory, it was simply home. The Caldwells had wanted to pressure her into feeling like an outsider, a temporary inconvenience in their plans. Instead, she'd established roots deeper than they had anticipated, becoming part of the community fabric in ways they couldn't easily unravel. 1 year to the day after inheriting her grandmother's house, Elena stood in the garden surveying the transformation. The property had evolved, not into something new and foreign, but into a thoughtful blend of preservation and renewal. The original architectural details remained intact, now highlighted by fresh paint and careful restoration. The garden beds followed her grandmother's original design, though Elena had gradually added native plants that attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. Inside, she converted the rarely used dining room into a dedicated workspace for her graphic design business, which had flourished once the neighborhood harassment subsided. 3 new local businesses have become clients after meeting her through community events, and she hired an assistant to help manage the increased workload. The cease and desist letter from Camila Rivera's office had proven remarkably effective. While Richard still lived next door, his campaign of intimidation had evaporated in the face of potential legal consequences. Occasionally, Elena would catch him watching her property with a sour expression, but their interactions had been reduced to terse nods when they happened to retrieve their mail simultaneously. Margaret Caldwell had made a surprising overture at the winter holidays, bringing over a poinsettia with a stiff but seemingly genuine apology. Richard can be determined, she'd admitted on Elena's doorstep, but I should have made my own judgments. The most significant change had occurred last month when Bill Harrington announced his retirement from the Neighborhood Association Board after 15 years of service. "We need new energy, new perspectives," he declared at the monthly meeting. "I'm nominating Elena Morgan for the open position. Her commitment to preserving neighborhood character while embracing necessary progress represents exactly the balance we need." Elena had been surprised by the nomination, and even more surprised when Richard Caldwell didn't immediately object. Instead, he remained silent as several neighbors seconded the nomination, citing Elena's thoughtful renovation approach and community involvement. Later that evening, Elena had overheard 2 longtime residents discussing the shift in neighborhood politics. "Richard's influence isn't what it used to be," one murmured to the other. "That business with the Morgan property backfired. People saw how he operates when he doesn't get his way." Today, as Elena planted cuttings from her grandmother's heirloom roses along the refurbished garden path, she noticed an unfamiliar car pull into the Caldwell's driveway. A young couple emerged, followed by a real estate agent who unlocked the front door with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Abernathy, who seemed to know everything that happened on the block before anyone else, appeared at the fence between their properties. "They're listing the house," she confirmed, nodding toward the Caldwells. "Moving to Arizona. Margaret's arthritis, apparently." Her knowing smile suggested multiple factors beyond medical concerns. "I had no idea they were planning to move," Elena said, genuinely surprised. "Very hush-hush. Richard wouldn't want anyone thinking he's retreating." Mrs. Abernathy adjusted her gardening hat. "The irony isn't lost on me. All that pressure for you to sell, and now they're the ones leaving." That evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, Elena hosted an impromptu gathering on her porch. The occasion was ostensibly to celebrate her election to the neighborhood board, but it felt like something more significant, a reclaiming of her grandmother's legacy of hospitality. Neighbors filled her porch and spilled into the front garden, admiring the blooming spring flowers. Bill Harrington raised a toast to Elena's first year in the neighborhood, describing how her grandmother would have been proud of how she'd made the house her own while honoring its history. As conversations flowed around her, Elena slipped away to the quiet corner of the garden where she created a small memorial space. Here she planted cuttings from every plant her grandmother had cultivated over 4 decades: roses, hydrangeas, lavender, and herbs, creating a living archive of Margaret's passion. She knelt to place a smooth river stone on one of the plants, painted with her grandmother's favorite saying, "Grow where you're planted." The words had taken on new meaning throughout her turbulent first year. When Elena returned to her guests, she noticed a realtor's sign now standing in the Caldwell's front yard. The irony wasn't lost on her. After all the pressure and manipulation, it would be Richard and Margaret who would leave the neighborhood, while the roots she established here grew stronger every day.